Good morning, everybody. And a real question I want to talk about today, something that also has been mulling around in my head. When I hear people say, I can't retire, those are three words that are really, really tough to tolerate, really tough to take, and unfortunately, even harder if a person gets into retirement and they truly can't afford it. Now, a lot of that comes down to planning. But I'll tell you what, I was coming across this story and I can really attest because I can double down. I know people personally, including my parents, which struggled with the very concept of holding debt, trying to unload debt, and constantly trying to work, retire, come in and out, and having a very, very difficult time in enjoying retirement for too long. And I mentioned to my dad he was getting a little bit bored. Of course, with golfing, went back to work. But again, I did allude to a point that some of that was related to the fact of finances. And I came across this story here actually this morning. It's interesting. There was this couple, this older couple, they retired. And the gentleman was a retired electrician, and the wife, she had a job too, full-time job. They worked their entire careers. They retired, and then a few short years later, they actually had to come out of retirement because they could no longer afford to live on what they were making, on a little bit of pensions, a little bit of security. They happen to live in Florida, which at least they have the nice weather going for them. But the unfortunate part is these folks could no longer afford to live. They had a small mortgage outstanding, which isn't uncommon today. That's something that we all are battling with today with the increasing cost of housing. You're always thinking about how much mortgage you've got to get that mortgage out of your way. And I did mention this in a previous video, and it's always easier said than done. And certainly we all aspire to try to get those big debts behind us, but it is a reality. And with prices of homes these days, it just, the span between what you earn versus the cost of some of your big investments like your home and your vehicles, that span is widening. And it's a frustrating time, and it's something we all struggle with, is trying to get rid of that debt, get that debt behind us. But this couple here had a small mortgage left, they had a small car payment, and they had about $12,000 in miscellaneous debt. Now, I did mention this previous too, that the biggest keys to try to get ahead of this and getting into retirement comfortably financially, that's part of it, is getting rid of unloading unwanted debt. But it's so sad because this heartbreaking story had this gentleman who was an electrician, worked all his life, blood, sweat, and tears, skin, knuckles, probably got electrified a few times, electrocuted, and just had his own, like everybody, right? You work 35, 40 years and you hope to take your time off. Well, he couldn't. He did for a short while, had to come back, then had to work in a stock house and loading trucks for a living, working way too hard, back to 40 hours a week, and very vocally about the fact that he's not too ecstatic about having to do this, but really have no choice. One other statistics I actually heard through this whole conversation was they said 11 million Americans, or 1 in 5 over 65, are actually can't afford, they don't have the money, and they're actually having to force themselves or get back into the workforce because they don't have the funds to stay ahead. As well, almost 50% of those in retirement aren't making ends meet and are falling behind every single year. Those are some sobering statistics. And some other things that I want to mention. How do we get ahead of that? Well, first of all, unfortunately, this becomes a planning conversation, and it's always easier said than done. But one thing I realized was, now I'm a little late in the game, and part of the problem was I come from more of a technical field. And see, this is the very problem, and I think this root stems back to schooling, to education. And so this all goes back to the 401k. Back in about 1978, there were some laws changed that allowed, the whole structure around retirement to be changed and altered, and allowed you as, the individual taking a retirement to manage some of your own money. And while that's great for those people that are savvy, these individuals, the gentleman, for example, was born and more or less raised on a farm. And folks like that often don't get the education. I didn't get the education Even my kids aren't getting the education. There's a clear gap in this whole system, and that's part of the problem here. They give you the tool, but they don't show you how to use it. Have you ever opened up a brand new expensive tool, maybe a weed trimmer, and you've got to put some parts together, and there's certain ways you have to prime it and fire it up, and then there's safety precautions and equipment you need, hearing protection, all these things. But if I just threw that at you and said, get her done, well, you'll probably get her done, but you're going to fumble and you might make mistakes. You might hurt yourself, and there will be some challenges along the way. Well, it's very much the same way. If you don't have that instruction manual of life, or that instruction manual related to how these pension systems work, how are you possibly supposed to know? I don't know. Most of us don't know. Sure, those that are savvy or do self-taught, or maybe research it a lot, or maybe they're in that field. I know people, friends of mine, that are in that industry, and they talk about it like it's the back of their hand. It's a very simple thing to discuss. But unfortunately, very few of us are actually educated in that way. And so we're almost have to self-taught. So this becomes a very systemic issue that I'm thinking, not to lay blame, because I think at the end of the day, poor spending habits, and maybe lack of foresight into the fact that we're all going to retire and how we plan for it, we all have to take our own level of accountability on that. But and honestly, and that's that. Like I'm at that point too right now, where I wish, and I mentioned this in previous videos too, about it wasn't until I was probably in my early mid 40s that I realized, we're getting close to retirement. What have I got going on? And sure, while I was putting a little bit of money into savings, RRSPs, things like that, early on, it wasn't a lot. And when we were young, they told us, if you put $100 a month, by the time you're 65, you'll have $1 million. Well, we know now that that's ridiculous, and that's likely never going to happen, and definitely didn't happen for me. So that was clearly another marketing scam or scheme by the banks and the governments to get you to put money, invest the money into the system. The big key here, though, is not calling out the governments. The point is, this is kind of a twofold thing. Self-education, commitment. You've got to take that commitment yourself, take it by the reins, and say, what do I need to do? A, to get out of these debts, credit card, housing debt, of course, car debts. We want to try to trim all that down or eliminate it altogether if we can. If we have a bigger house and we're still paying a mortgage on it, and we're infringing on 5 to 10 years, maybe 5 years within your projected retirement date, you might even want to just downsize it, sell the house. I mean, do you need a house that looks like that when you're 65, 70? I don't know. Maybe some people like that, and that's great. It's a beautiful shack. But I'm not sure it's necessarily necessary. And if you're trying to get by, trying to survive, the cost of living crisis is eating us all up alive. It's like mosquitoes coming out of here. It's just, if I sit in here at night, these things will chew me up, eat me up, and basically suck all my life juices out of me. That's the problem. Well, that's life in general. So you've got to be savvy. You've got to take reins, and you've got to take some ownership for where you're going to be. And in some cases, this is something you control. In other cases, it's devastating because, again, I've seen this. I've seen some friends, I've seen coworkers that have tried to do that, and then they get ill or they get hurt or disabled, and then they're not in a position where even if they wanted to, they're not, they lose money goes away because they lose their job because something happens to them. Maybe they're not working for one of those companies that takes care of them, and then unfortunately they're stuck without a job, paying medical bills, and now next thing you know, their whole world is turned upside down. And that's a very, very sad state, and that happens all too often. But the reality is, can I afford to retire? I can't afford to retire, sadly, is a set of words that I hear all too often. I saw it in my parents. I see it in the eyes of many people, and I see it in a lot of the views and comments I get here. I love my work, or I can't afford to retire. And when a lot of people say I love their work, they legitimately love their work. But there are some people that are tucked in there, and if you read between the lines, maybe they don't love their work so much, and they're loving the idea of not being out of work and keeping that steady paycheck flowing. So in a lot of cases, that's really all it is. And my question to that would be, if you love your work, let me ask you this. Is there anything on this planet that drives you more? Would you rather be golfing, maybe fishing, maybe doing some gardening work or hanging out with the grandkids? Is there anything else you'd rather be doing? Because surefire, I'm going to say 9 times out of 10, there's always something better to be doing if money wasn't the issue. So anyway, that's so heartbreaking. The big thing here is going into retirement, simplifying. I already mentioned this before, but also maybe consider having a couple years worth of wages in front of you. If you're going into retirement, you're a little unsure, it's that transition period. What I would suggest is budget for your spendings. Maybe not a full wage, but as you reduce and you simplify your work, definitely I would suggest in maybe having a couple years or 2 good seasons worth of savings that are yielding a little bit of benefit, yielding a little bit of profits, and of course interest. And then maybe that's enough to keep you going, build that confidence, and then see where this whole system goes for you. Because it's not easy, and honestly, I know it's that transition period where you're not sure. But remember, the bottom line is simplifying is the best way. Well, I'd love to hear your comments. How did you prepare for retirement? And do you truly feel that you're prepared? You can financially afford to retire. I'd love to hear it below. And thanks as always. Hope to see each and every one of you soon. Bye-bye.